Hello, and welcome to an all new episode of the Transfix Take podcast, where each week, of course, we deliver news, insights, and trends for shippers and carriers. Now, it's the week of May 8th. I'm Jenny Ruiz, and I'm joined by none other than our market expert, Justin Mays. Mays, we are 1 week away officially from DOT Blitz week. How are you feeling about it?
I'm feeling good. It's the calm before the storm. I don't think it's going to be significant volatility, but we're definitely going to see some volatility. It's going to be mirroring last year, essentially.
Yeah, last year was intense, but we'll get through those numbers in just a bit. Now, obviously, a little bit about Blitz Week. It starts the morning on Tuesday, May 14th. So next Tuesday, as we record this, and then ends the evening of Thursday, May 16th. I think we should note there's two main focuses for these spot inspections. There's tractor protection systems, and then alcohol and controlled substance protection. So we'll get into its effects a little later on, but it's important to note that this week you should, like Mace just said, expect some volatility, specifically towards maybe the end of the week and somewhat mirroring the last 7 days, where the national average rate per mile saw a slim increase towards the end of the week through the weekend. Mays, walk us through what we saw and give us a look at where tender rejections sit as well, if you could.
Yeah, definitely. Tender rejections right now sit still above, 3.2%. We saw rates, as you mentioned, creep up towards the end of last week, really primarily driven in the produce areas like Southern California, Florida, even Georgia. Now, Texas did kind of spark a little fire itself where capacity tightened up in Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, which drew up some rates in the southern region as well. But going into this week, we saw rates kind of flatline or bottom out again. And like you called out, we expect rates to fall through the beginning of the week, but then start to feel some tightening as we approach the weekend.
All right. It's going to be one of those peaks and valley type of weeks. But that said, you know what it's time for? The regional breakdown. Now, the Midwest continues to see its downward trend, with about 90% of markets seeing decreases. I mean, some of the breakout markets that kept their gains were Charleston, West Virginia, Evansville, and Indianapolis, Indiana, and Louisville, Kentucky. Do you think we'll see any changes here in the next 7 days?
I don't think we're going to see any changes whatsoever, really. We're going to continue to see that downward trend until next week. Now, the Midwest is going to be one of those regions that aren't as volatile as the rest of the country during DO2 week, but still expect some volatility. A lot of large fleets have, their hubs there. So if they are taking equipment offline, they're most likely going to be heading to the Midwest. So opposite to what it has been, it's probably going to be somewhere that is a little bit easier potentially sending trucks to at the end of the week as they get home to their hubs.
All right. Now, the Northeast saw slight gains in its short hauls, but of course, it continues to be one of the, if not the least attractive region for carriers as we approach that 8% loss change in a 60-day period. Anything of note in this region, Maze?
I would say the number one thing to note is the highest volume markets like Harrisburg, Philadelphia are starting to see even more loosening. But then on the flip side, up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, we're seeing some tightening, but it's primarily driven, like you mentioned, on the shorter and local runs. So overall, I think we're going to continue to see downward pressure. I mean, rates going down to the Southeast from the Northeast have significantly declined as we anticipated, and this is going to continue as the Southeast heatens up.
We'll get to that region in a sec, but the coastal region is definitely starting to see some gains across all lengths of haul. We've just seen about a 0.5% increase in the last 7 days, which is a different story than what we've been seeing, I would say, over the last month. Maze, you predicted this would happen. So what should we count on in the next few days here?
This is going to continue. The increase is primarily driven by the freight that's heading up to the Northeast and Midwest. On the flip side, freight going out of the Southeast is very favorable for shippers. This is going to continue. It's going to continue to intensify. So the rates that are increasing going up to the Northeast and Midwest are probably going to start shifting the average rate out of the coastal region, but it really depends on what lane you are traveling on.
All right, let's get into our trifecta of exciting regions here. Moving over to the West Coast, which in looking at the last 7 days seems to have quieted down just a bit, but overall we're hitting just about a 1% increase in the last 60 days, which should be no surprise given the seasonality heating up here. What is the West Coast story?
Yeah, this is going to continue, as you mentioned. The highest volume markets on the West Coast, Phoenix, Vegas, Southern California, Ontario, Los Angeles, are continuing to see capacity tighten, as
Hmm.
we would normally anticipate this throughout this point of the year. But I think DOT Week's going to throw a wrench in it all and really spark the intensification up, with rates moving upward. Where, as we mentioned last week, carriers haven't experienced that at all this year until recently. So it's something that shippers are going to have to plan for.
It is their time. I mean, the South continues to heat up. We're seeing rates continue to rise across most lengths of haul, with the exception of city and local runs. But there doesn't seem to be that big of a boiling point like we've been seeing over the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc. Do you think that this is in anticipation of DOT week, or maybe something different?
I don't think it's anticipation for DOT just yet. I think it's just the peaks and valleys that the South experiences throughout this point of the year. The one call out is that every high volume market, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, experience pretty noticeable tightening. If this tightening doesn't ease in the beginning of this week, then we're definitely going to see the outcome of the average rate in the South really change over the next 2 weeks. But if
Okay.
we do start experiencing some looseness in these higher volume markets, then we're going to be back on pace to where we were last week.
All right. Now, closing out with the hottest region of the week. No surprise, it's the Southeast. We're seeing a lot of red. So let's zero in on this region here. Cross country runs are seeing 1.27% increase. Long and mid hauls are near 2.5%. And those short hauls are seeing almost 2% over the last 7 days. So, should we expect consistency over the next few days into the weekend here, Maze? What's going on?
We're in the period of the year where the Southeast is the hottest region for carriers.
Yeah.
This is not going to stop. It's not just Florida. Florida has seen some pretty significant gains over the last 14 days, but it's even the state of Georgia and the highest volume market in the Southeast, Atlanta. As these higher volume markets continue to heat up, it's only going to continue to pull capacity from neighboring markets that generally just continue that domino effect across the Southeast. And then you could start experiencing that upward in the coastal region, as we were mentioning earlier. So this trend is here to stay. It's not going to change. DOT week will again just intensify it.
Yeah.
And then going into Memorial Day weekend, even more intensification down in the Southeast.
Yeah, I mean, back to back to back. But, we've been anticipating DOT week this quarter, which, as you mentioned, comes literally on the heels of Memorial Day weekend. So let's get into some quick facts before we get into the numbers. Or I guess we've got some numbers here too. But inspectors conduct an average of 15 truck inspections every minute during the 72-hour enforcement period. Last year, inspectors found that nearly 1 in 5, which is 19% of inspected vehicles, had violations that put them out of service. So that means that the vehicles couldn't be driven until those issues were obviously fixed, and this can cause delays for shippers and severe frustration for drivers, especially as the markets are starting to just start to heat up. And this is not just in the U.S; it's an international effort. So if you're running cross country, this also affects freight in Canada and in Mexico. So here's where we start looking at numbers. Maze, can you give us a bit of a walkthrough of how this affected 2023?
Yeah, so 2023, we were generally in the same feeling of a freight market where it was extremely soft,
Yeah.
heavily in favor of shippers, just like we are today. But rates were actually lower at the time we entered DOT week, and so
Mm.
were rejections. Rates were at $1.59 line haul per mile, and tender rejections were all the way down at 2.5%. Now, both of these experienced pretty significant increases. Rates went up about 12% in aggregate throughout the week of DOT heading into Memorial Day weekend. And
Yeah.
then tender rejections saw a short stunt upward by about 0.75% before falling again after Memorial Day weekend. But last year we saw rates continue to be elevated from the point of DOT week all the way through 4th of July. So that's something that we're going to look very closely at this year, to see if carriers are able to continue to maintain that momentum in the market.
Fingers crossed. I mean, we've seen a lot of, I think, what are we at, the 25th month now, likely, of rates being really low. So I'm hoping that 19% is not nearly as high this year. Hopefully we'll get to lower numbers as, trucks get off the road during that inspection blitz. We will see. So when we record next week, we'll be right in the middle of the Blitz, and we'll give you an up-to-date look at where we are from the weekend. But with that, we'll see you next week with an all-new episode of the Transfix Take podcast. Until then, drive safely. Put some extra attention on those pre and post trips. That is super, super, super important. We'll see you next week.